The carriage rattled to a halt before the towering gates of Château Noir, its silhouette etched against the blood-red sky. Isabelle stepped out, her gloved fingers trembling as they adjusted the delicate mask obscuring her face. The invitation had arrived without warning, its wax seal bearing an unfamiliar crest. Yet, its promise of mystery and indulgence had been too alluring to resist. The doors of the château groaned open, revealing a grand hall illuminated by flickering candelabras. Gilded mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the masked revelers who glided across the marble floor in a symphony of color and sound. The air was thick with the scent of wine and rosewater, undercut by something earthier. Darker, that Isabelle couldn't place. A hand brushed her arm. She turned to find herself gazing into the piercing eyes of a man whose presence seemed to command the room. His mask, carved from black obsidian, revealed only his sharp jawline and sensuous mouth. "Bienvenue," he said, his voice a velvet caress. "You honor us with your presence tonight, Mademoiselle Isabelle," she managed, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Isabelle," he repeated, the syllables dripping like honey from his lips. "I am Count Armand. I trust you will find tonight's entertainment unforgettable." He led her through the throng, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. The heat of his touch seared through her silk gown, sending shivers up her spine. She could feel the weight of his gaze, lingering on her as though he could see beneath the layers of fabric, to the secrets hidden beneath. The Count guided her to a secluded alcove where a table awaited, laden with crimson wine and delicacies she couldn't name. He poured her a glass, the ruby liquid catching the light like freshly spilled blood. "Tell me, Isabelle," he said, his tone both commanding and intimate, "what drew you?" "I suppose I was curious," she replied, taking a sip of the wine. Its taste was rich, intoxicating, with a metallic tang that left her lips tingling. "Your invitation promised something extraordinary, and extraordinary you shall have," he said, his lips curling into a predatory smile. As the night deepened, the revelry grew stranger. Guests abandoned the dance floor, disappearing into shadowy corridors and behind locked doors. Laughter turned to murmurs, and murmurs to whispers of something forbidden. Isabelle felt the shift in the air, a tension that coiled around her like a snake. Armand appeared at her side once more, his hand reaching for hers. "There is something I must show you," he said. "If you are brave enough to see." His words were a challenge, and Isabelle found herself unable to refuse. He led her through a hidden passage, the flickering light of his candle casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The corridor descended into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. At last, they emerged into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient tapestries depicting scenes of ecstasy and agony. At the center stood an ornate bed draped in crimson velvet, its posts carved with figures locked in eternal embraces. Armand turned to her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. "This is the heart of Château Noir," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Where masks are shed, and truths are revealed." Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his fingers brushing the edge of her mask. "May I?" he asked, his breath warm against her skin. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. With deliberate care, he removed the mask, his eyes devouring her unveiled face. "Exquisite," he murmured, his hand trailing down her cheek to her throat, where her pulse raced beneath his touch. His lips met hers with a hunger that stole her breath, his kiss a heady mix of dominance and toned her body, exploring every curve as though committing her to memory. Isabelle's inhibitions melted away, replaced by a desire as dark and consuming as the man before her. Yet, even as she surrendered to his touch, a nagging sense of unease gnawed at the edges of her mind. The tapestries seemed to come alive, their figures writhing in the flickering candlelight. She pulled away, her breath ragged. "What is this place, Armand?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This," he said, gesturing to the room, "is where desires are made manifest. But beware, Isabelle. Desire is a double-edged blade, and those who wield it must be prepared to pay its price." His words sent a chill through her. But the lure of the forbidden was too strong to resist. As the night unfolded, Isabelle found herself drawn deeper into Armand's world, her every fear and longing laid bare beneath his gaze. The boundary between pleasure and pain blurred, leaving her adrift in a sea of sensations she could neither name nor control, but with each passing moment, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the whispers louder. Isabelle began to realize that the chateau's secrets were not confined to its walls. They were alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that sought to ensnare her, and at the center of it all was Armand, his intentions as enigmatic as the man himself. Was he her savior or her undoing? The answer, she knew, would determine whether she left Château Noir with her soul intact, or lost to the darkness forever. Armand's hand trailed down Isabelle's back as he guided her to the velvet-draped bed. The heat of his touch lingered on her skin, his presence a magnetic force pulling her further into his web. Her pulse quickened as his lips grazed the shell of her ear. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice velvet soft. "Do I frighten you?" "Yes," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "But I don't want you to stop." His laughter was low and rich, a sound that sent a shiver coursing through her. He pressed a finger beneath her chin, tilting her face to meet his eyes. The intensity of his stare was disarming, as if he could see every secret, every forbidden desire she'd ever harbored. "Good," he said. "Fear and desire are closer than you think. Let them guide you tonight." His lips found hers again, this time with a hunger that bordered on desperation. His hands moved with practiced precision, loosening the laces of her gown and exposing the pale curve of her shoulders. Isabelle felt the cool air against her skin, followed by the heat of his mouth trailing along her collarbone. Her body responded instinctively, arching into his touch as her inhibitions dissolved. As her gown pooled at her feet, Armand stepped back, his gaze raking over her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and exalted. "You are a vision," he said, his voice thick with reverence. Before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber, shattering the intimate moment. Armand's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Stay here," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He crossed the room in long, deliberate strides and disappeared into the corridor. Isabelle's heart pounded as she stood there, the sudden absence of his presence leaving her feeling untethered. The knock had unsettled her. But more than that, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the tapestries, and for a moment, she could have sworn the figures were moving, writhing in silent agony. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the fabric. The scene depicted was grotesque, a woman entwined with a man, their expressions a mix of ecstasy and torment. But the longer she stared, the more she realized there was something horribly wrong. The figures weren't painted, they were fascinating, isn't it? Armand's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Souls," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Those who gave themselves to the chateau but could not handle its truths. They remain here, trapped in their final moments of desire and despair." Isabelle's breath caught in her throat. "And what happens to those who survive?" A slow smile spread across Armand's lips. "They become part of something greater. But survival requires a strength not many possess." She backed away, her heart pounding. "Why did you bring me here?" "To show you what you're capable of," he said, stepping closer. His hand reached out, and despite her fear, she didn't resist when he pulled her into his arms. "You intrigue me, Isabelle. Your fear, your desire, they make you different from the others." "I don't want to end up like them," she said, her voice trembling. "Then don't," he replied simply. "Surrender to the chateau, to me, and I promise you'll find power beyond anything you've ever imagined." His words were hypnotic, and despite the warning bells ringing in her mind, Isabelle felt herself drawn to him once more. His lips captured hers, and this time, the kiss was fierce, almost punishing. His hands roamed her body with an urgency that left her breathless. But just as she began to lose herself in him, she felt a sharp pain at the base of her neck. She gasped, pulling back to see a trickle of blood on his lips. "What did you do?" she demanded, her hand flying to the small wound. "Only what was necessary," he said, his voice calm. The Château demands a piece of you before it grants you its gifts. You've taken the first step, Isabelle. There's no turning back now. Her vision blurred, the room spinning around her. She stumbled, and Armand caught her, his arms the only thing keeping her upright. What's happened? You're awakening, he said, his voice a mixture of tenderness and triumph. Darkness enveloped her, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the chamber. She stood in a vast, shadowy expanse, the Château's walls stretching endlessly around her. Figures moved in the darkness, their faces obscured, their whispers indecipherable. Armand appeared beside her, his presence grounding her in the surreal landscape. This is the heart of the Château, he said. A realm where desires and fears collide. It's where you'll find your true self, Isabelle, if you're strong enough to face it. The figures in the darkness began to move closer, their shapes becoming more distinct. Isabelle recognized some of them, guests from the masquerade. Their faces contorted in expressions of ecstasy and terror. What do they want? She asked, her voice shaking. They want what you have, Armand said. A chance to be free. The figures lunged toward her, and Isabelle screamed as their hands clawed at her, pulling her into their desperate embrace. But just as she felt herself being consumed, a surge of defiance welled up within her. She pushed back, the force of her will driving them away. Armand's smile was one of pure admiration. You're stronger than I thought, he said. As the shadows receded, Isabelle felt a newfound power coursing through her veins. The Château had tested her and she had prevailed, but she knew the true challenge was just beginning. Our sensation of power rushing through Isabelle was intoxicating, as if the Château itself had imbued her with a fragment of its dark essence. Her breathing was uneven, her body trembling, not from fear, but from exhilaration. She turned to Armand, his presence both a balm and a torment. What have you done to me? She asked, her voice a mix of awe and accusation. I've only opened the door, he replied, stepping closer. His hand traced the curve of her jaw, his touch as light as a whisper. You, my dear, step through it. She pulled away, her mind racing with questions, but her body betraying her with its yearning for his touch. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice trembling. No one does, Armand said, his tone almost gentle. But once the Château chooses you, there is no going back. You belong to it now, Isabelle. And to me. The possessiveness in his voice sent a shiver through her, but she refused to let it consume her. I don't belong to anyone, she said defiantly, her chin lifting. Armand's smile was predatory, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. We'll see. The room shifted again, the shadows retreating to reveal a lavish boudoir. The bed, draped in black silk, dominated the space, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something darker, something primal. Isabelle felt her pulse quicken as Armand approached her, his movements fluid and predatory. You're fighting yourself, Isabelle, he said, his voice low and hypnotic. I can see it in your eyes. The desire, the fear. Let me take it all away. Before she could respond, his lips were on hers, claiming her with a hunger that left her breathless. His hands explored her body with a mastery that made her knees weak, and she found herself giving in, her resistance melting like wax under the heat of his touch. But just as she surrendered to the pleasure, a sharp knock shattered the moment. Isabelle gasped, pulling away as Armand's expression darkened. Stay here, he commanded, his voice like steel. This time, she didn't obey. As soon as he disappeared into the corridor, she slipped out of the boudoir, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floor. She moved through the Château like a shadow, her senses heightened by the strange power coursing through her. The air grew colder as she descended a spiral staircase, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected not her image, but strange and grotesque visions. In one, she saw herself bound to the bed, her body writhing in pleasure and pain as shadowy figures loomed over her. In another, she was standing over a man's lifeless body, her hands stained with blood. What is this place? She whispered. Her voice trembling. It's a mirror of your soul, came a voice behind her. She turned to see a woman clad in a gown of shimmering black, her face obscured by a silver mask. The chateau reveals what you are, what you could be, and what you fear most. Who are you? Isabelle asked, taking a cautious step back. I was like you once, the woman said, her voice tinged with sadness. Drawn here by the promise of something extraordinary. But the chateau takes as much as it gives. Be careful, Isabelle. Armand is not what he seems. Before Isabelle could ask more, the woman vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of roses. Isabelle's heart raced as she continued down the staircase. Her mind spinning with questions, she emerged into a grand hall where Armand stood with a group of masked figures. They were gathered around a stone altar, and Isabelle's breath caught as she saw what, or who, was on it. A woman, bound and trembling, her eyes wide with terror. What are you doing? Isabelle demanded, stepping into the room. Armand turned to her, his expression unreadable. This is the price of power, he said. The chateau demands a sacrifice. You've already felt its pull, Isabelle. This is what sustains it. Oh, she said, shaking her head. I didn't agree to this. You already have, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The moment you accepted the chateau's gift, you became part of its cycle. If you want to survive, you must embrace it. The other figures turned to her, their masks hiding their expressions but not their intent. Isabelle felt their gaze like a physical weight, and she realized with a sinking dread that they were waiting for her to make a choice. Her mind raced, torn between the allure of the power she'd tasted and the horror of what it required. There has to be another way, she said, her voice trembling. There isn't, Armand said, stepping closer. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll guide you, Isabelle. Together, we can rule the chateau. You have no idea how powerful you could be. His words were a seductive promise, but the memory of the woman in the mask lingered in Isabelle's mind. And if I refuse? She asked. Then you'll become like them, Armand said, gesturing to the bound woman. A pawn, a sacrifice. The chateau doesn't tolerate weakness, Isabelle. You're either a player or a piece on the board. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the chateau's expectations pressing down on her. Isabelle knew she had to make a choice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she chose, the chateau would never truly let her go. And somewhere deep within her, a voice whispered, is it really so terrible to want this? No, she said, shaking her head. I didn't agree to this. You already have, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The moment you accepted the chateau's gift, you became part of its cycle. If you want to survive, you must embrace it. The other figures turned to her, their masks hiding their expressions but not their intent. Isabelle felt their gaze like a physical weight, and she realized with a sinking dread that they were waiting for her to make a choice. Her mind raced, torn between the allure of the power she'd tasted and the horror of what it required. There has to be another way, she said, her voice trembling. There isn't, Armand said, stepping closer. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll guide you, Isabelle. Together, we can rule the chateau. You have no idea how powerful you could be. His words were a seductive promise, but the memory of the woman in the mask lingered in Isabelle's mind. And if I refuse? She asked. Then you'll become like them, Armand said, gesturing to the bound woman. A pawn, a sacrifice. The chateau doesn't tolerate weakness, Isabelle. You're either a player or a piece on the board. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the chateau's expectations pressing down on her. Isabelle knew she had to make a choice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she chose, the chateau would never truly let her go. And somewhere deep within her, a voice whispered, is it really so terrible to want this? Isabelle's heart pounded, the words Armand had spoken wrapping around her like chains. The bound woman on the altar whimpered, her fear slicing through the heavy, perfumed air. Isabelle's instincts screamed for her to run, but an insidious pull rooted her in place, the chateau's dark essence coursing through her veins and clouding her thoughts. Armand moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You feel it, don't you?" he murmured. "The chateau has already—" Isabelle couldn't shake the chateau's lingering pull even after their victory over the shadows. Though the air seemed lighter, a persistent whisper followed her wherever she went. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her newfound alliance with Armand. He seemed changed, more human, less like the predator who had first ensnared her, but the chateau was not so easily defeated. One night, as Isabelle slept, the whispers became screams, pulling her from her dreams into a waking nightmare. Her room, once lavish and comforting, twisted before her eyes. The walls dripped with blood, the mirrors reflecting distorted versions of herself, some weeping, others screaming, but all staring at her with hollow eyes. "You can't escape," the whispers taunted. "The chateau owns you." Isabelle bolted upright, sweat slicking her skin. She stumbled into the corridor, calling for Armand. But instead of his voice, the chateau responded. Doors slammed, the chandeliers flickered, and the air turned icy. A figure emerged from the shadows, the masked woman she had seen before. Her voice was cold, hollow. "I warned you, Isabelle. The chateau doesn't forgive. What does it want from me?" Isabelle cried. "It doesn't want. It takes," the woman said, her mask cracking to reveal a rotted, skeletal face. The walls around Isabelle seemed to close in, the air pressing down on her chest. She tried to run. But the chateau twisted, leading her in circles until she was back in the grand hall. The stone altar stood at its center, now slick with fresh blood. Armand appeared, his face pale, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Before he could answer, the shadows surged again, but this time, they weren't after him. They lunged for Isabelle, wrapping around her like chains. She screamed, fighting against their grip, but they were relentless. "Armand!" she cried. He stepped forward, his expression torn, but the chateau's power held him back. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "It's too late." The shadows dragged Isabelle to the altar, their icy tendrils slicing into her skin. The masked figures reappeared, their chanting growing louder, more frenzied. "No!" Isabelle screamed, thrashing against her bonds. But the chateau was merciless. She felt the cold blade of a dagger press against her chest, wielded by one of the masked figures. As the blade plunged into her heart, her world exploded in pain and darkness. The last thing she saw was Armand's face, twisted in anguish, but death was not the end for Isabelle. She awoke to a suffocating silence. Her body weightless, her surroundings shrouded in a misty haze. She was no longer in the chateau, yet she couldn't escape its presence. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You're between worlds," came a voice. The masked woman appeared again, but this time, her face was fully visible, beautiful and tragic, her features marred by faint scars. "What happened to me?" Isabelle asked, her hands clutching at her chest where the dagger had struck. "You're dead," the woman said bluntly. "The chateau claimed you. But it wasn't satisfied. You resisted, and now it's cursed you to roam its halls forever." "No," Isabelle whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be." "You're not the first," the woman continued. "And you won't be the last. The chateau feeds on souls like ours, trapping us in its endless cycle of torment." Isabelle felt a surge of rage, her despair giving way to defiance. "I won't let it control me. There has to be a way to break free." "There is none," the woman said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But you can fight back." In her spectral form, Isabelle discovered that she could manipulate the chateau's twisted energy. She haunted the masked figures, shattering their rituals and freeing other would-be presence became a source of terror for the chateau's inhabitants, her rage manifesting in violent, supernatural outbursts. But the chateau fought back. It used Armand against her, luring him into traps designed to weaken her resolve. Though Isabelle tried to resist, her lingering feelings for him left her vulnerable. One night, she found him in the grand hall, staring at the blood-stained altar. "You're here," he said softly, as if sensing her presence. "Armand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "Isabelle, I'm sorry. I didn't know this would happen." "You could have stopped it," she said, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "I tried," he said, stepping closer. "But the chateau is stronger than all of us. It won't stop until it consumes everything. Then we destroy it," she said, her resolve hardening. Together, they began to unravel the chateau's secrets, searching for a way to end its reign of terror. But the chateau fought them at every turn, its shadows growing more aggressive, its whispers more insidious. The final confrontation came in the heart of the chateau, where its power was strongest. Isabelle and Armand faced the shadows together, their combined strength pushing back the darkness. But as they delivered the final blow, the chateau unleashed its fury. Armand was pulled into the void, his screams echoing in Isabelle's ears. "No!" she cried, reaching for him, but it was too late. The chateau collapsed around her, its power dissipating into nothingness. Isabelle was left alone, her spectral form bound to the ruins of the chateau. She had destroyed its power, but at a great cost. Now, she roams the ruins, a ghost driven by both vengeance and sorrow, forever searching for a way to reunite with Armand and find peace. And those who dare to enter the chateau's remains often speak of a beautiful, tragic figure who haunts the halls, her presence marked by flickering lights and the chilling sound of a woman's whisper, "Leave before it's too late." Isabelle's ghostly presence was bound to the chateau, not by choice, but by an insidious tether that refused to let her go. Though the chateau itself had crumbled, its essence, a dark, malignant force, remained rooted in the ruins. Isabelle, once a victim, was now its unwilling sentinel. She haunted the ruins because the chateau demanded it. It whispered to her even in death, promising her freedom if she fulfilled its bidding. But the chateau lied. Each soul she encountered, each life she tried to save, only strengthened its grip on her. One storm-laden night, a group of thrill-seekers entered the ruins, laughing and jeering at the stories of a ghostly woman who haunted the halls. Isabelle tried to warn them, manifesting in flickering lights and mournful wails. But they dismissed her as folklore. She watched, helpless, as the ruins began to shift around them. The chateau, feeding on their arrogance, twisted its broken corridors into a labyrinth of horror. The thrill-seekers' laughter turned to screams as walls closed in, shadows reached out, and the air thickened with the stench of decay. Isabelle's rage and sorrow merged, her spectral form growing more powerful with every terrified scream. She tried to resist the chateau's pull, but her connection to its dark essence was too strong. As the thrill-seekers begged for their lives, Isabelle's spirit lashed out, her form grotesque and otherworldly. Their bodies crumpled, their souls devoured by the lingering malevolence of the chateau. In the aftermath, Isabelle wept, her translucent hands clawing at the earth. The chateau whispered again, taunting her. "You are mine, Isabelle. You always will be." The true horror of Isabelle's haunting lay in her own torment. She wasn't just a ghost, she was a prisoner, forced to act as the chateau's executioner. And worse, she was beginning to lose herself. One night, a young girl named Clara wandered into the ruins, drawn by a dare from her friends. Unlike the others, Clara carried no malice or arrogance. She stepped carefully, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Isabelle. Are you here?" The name stopped Isabelle in her tracks. For a moment, the chateau's whispers faded, replaced by a faint memory of her human life, a fleeting moment of warmth, of hope. She materialized before Clara, her form flickering between beauty and terror. "Why are you here?" Isabelle asked, her voice both gentle and chilling. Clara's eyes welled with tears. I wanted to know if the stories were true. About you. About what happened." Isabelle reached out, her translucent hand brushing against Clara's cheek. For the first time, she felt something other than the chateau's cold grip, an ember of humanity, but the chateau was watching. The ruins began to quake, shadows coiling around Clara. Isabelle turned, her form erupting in a burst of spectral fire. "No!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the ruins. The chateau fought back, summoning the masked figures of the past, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. Isabelle battled them, her ghostly form twisting and contorting as she unleashed her fury. Clara watched in terror as the ghostly war unfolded around her. Isabelle, despite her monstrous appearance, protected her with ferocious determination. Finally, with a deafening roar, Isabelle drove the shadows back into the depths of the ruins. As the dust settled, Isabelle turned to Clara, her form dim and flickering. "You must leave," she said. "The chateau won't stop until it has you too." Clara hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "But what about you?" "I'm already lost," Isabelle said. "But you. You still have a chance." Before Clara could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled. The chateau was awakening again, its anger palpable. Isabelle used the last of her strength to create an opening, pushing Clara toward. Isabelle screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. Clara stumbled out of the ruins, her sobs mixing with the howling wind. She turned back just in time to see the ruins collapse inward, a final, agonized scream echoing from within. But Isabelle wasn't gone. Clara began to experience strange occurrences in the weeks that followed, cold spots in her home, whispers in the dark, and fleeting glimpses of a woman in her peripheral vision. Isabelle's ghost was tied to her now, seeking a way to sever her connection to the chateau once and for all, yet, the chateau's influence lingered, growing stronger with each passing night. And Clara began to wonder if saving Isabelle's spirit meant damning her own. Clara couldn't escape Isabelle's presence. Every night, she felt the ghost's sorrow and anger, her faint whispers brushing against the edges of her consciousness. At first, Clara thought Isabelle was merely a restless spirit, a victim seeking justice. But the haunting grew darker, more desperate. Isabelle wasn't just tethered to her for protection, she was searching for something. One night, Clara dreamed of the chateau in its prime. The halls were alive with music, the air thick with candlelight and decadence. In the dream, Isabelle stood in the center of the grand hall, her beauty radiant, her laughter echoing. But as Clara approached her, the dream twisted. The walls bled, the laughter turned to screams. And Isabelle's face crumbled into a hollow, skeletal visage. "You must return," Isabelle whispered, her voice breaking with grief. Clara jolted awake, gasping. The meaning was clear. Isabelle's torment could only end where it had begun. Reluctantly, Clara returned to the ruins. The air was colder than she remembered, the shadows thicker. She called out to Isabelle, her voice trembling. "I'm here. Tell me what I need to do." The ruins groaned, and Isabelle materialized, her form flickering and unstable. "The chateau still owns a piece of me," she said, her voice tinged with both urgency and despair. "My soul is fractured. The part that remains here fuels its power. You must destroy it." Clara swallowed hard. "How? Where is it?" Isabelle gestured toward the collapsed remains of the altar. "Beneath the stone lies my heart. It was torn from me during the ritual. As long as it remains, the chateau will never release me." Clara hesitated, the weight of the task pressing down on her. But Isabelle's spectral form began to contort, her eyes darkening. "Hurry!" she screamed, her voice layered with otherworldly echoes. "It's trying to stop us." The ground trembled, and the ruins seemed to come alive. Shadows lunged at Clara, their icy claws raking her skin. Isabelle fought them off, her ghostly light blazing with fury. "Dig!" she commanded. Clara clawed at the dirt and stone with trembling hands. Blood seeped from her fingers as she unearthed a small, ornate box buried beneath the rubble. The moment her hands touched it, the air around her turned suffocatingly cold. "Open it," Isabelle urged, her voice strained as she held back the encroaching darkness. Inside the box lay Isabelle's heart, blackened, shriveled, and pulsating faintly, as if still alive. The sight of it filled Clara with dread, but she knew what had to be done. "How do I destroy it?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. The blade, Isabelle said, her form flickering. The dagger that killed me. It's here, hidden in the shadows. Find it. As the chateau roared in protest, Clara stumbled through the ruins, the shadows clawing at her every step. She felt the oppressive weight of the chateau's fury, its whispers growing louder, more insidious. You can't save her, it hissed. She belongs to us. Clara's determination wavered, but then she saw it, a glint of metal half buried in the dirt. She grabbed the dagger, its handle cold and jagged. Returning to Isabelle, she held the dagger over the heart. Are you sure this will work? Nodded, her eyes glistening with both hope and fear. It's the only way. Do it. Clara drove the dagger into the heart. The moment the blade pierced it, the ground erupted in a deafening roar. A torrent of shadows burst from the ruins, screaming as they dissolved into the air. Isabelle's form glowed brighter, her edges softening. She looked at Clara, her expression one of profound relief. Thank you, she whispered. It's over. But before Clara could respond, the chateau unleashed its final twist. The shadows coalesced into a monstrous form, a grotesque amalgamation of the souls it had consumed. It lunged at Clara, its howls deafening. Isabelle stepped between them. Her light blazing like the sun. You will not take her. She screamed, her voice shaking the very air. With a final burst of power, Isabelle unleashed all that remained of her spirit. The shadows disintegrated, their anguished cries fading into silence. The ruins collapsed completely, the last remnants of the chateau's evil swallowed by the earth. Clara stood alone in the aftermath, her body trembling. The air was still, the oppressive weight lifted. She felt a faint warmth on her shoulder and turned to see Isabelle's ghostly figure, now radiant and serene. Thank you, Isabelle said, her voice soft. I'm free. Clara watched as Isabelle's form dissolved into light, her spirit finally at peace. But as she left the ruins, she couldn't shake the feeling that some part of the chateau's darkness still lingered, waiting for another chance to rise. The story of Isabelle and the chateau might have ended, but the scars it left behind would never truly fade.